18 seconds. From the moment the driver's professional intuition overrode the placid visual data his eyes were receiving, to the instant his 2.5-ton armored vehicle made kinetic contact with the blockade, 18 seconds elapsed. This was the total duration of his decision window. In that sliver of time, a period shorter than a typical commercial break, he was confronted with a binary choice, each option carrying the weight of absolute finality. He could follow standard operating procedure, a doctrine written in the sterile quiet of a corporate boardroom, or he could follow the unwritten law of the kill zone, a brutal commandment forged in the unforgiving crucible of countless violent encounters. The stakes of this decision were quantifiable and immense. In the cargo hold behind him, secured in reinforced containers, sat $5 million in untraceable, non-sequential, bearer bonds and processed cash. His two colleagues, the passenger guard responsible for communications and the cargo guard in the rear compartment, placed their lives entirely in his hands. And outside, waiting with military patience, was a 6-man team we would later identify as a specialized enforcement squad for a major trafficking organization, a cartel kill squad. They were not common criminals. They were professionals, and they had chosen this ground with surgical precision. Our purpose here is not to sensationalize the ensuing violence. It is to dissect the 18-second decision that rendered that violence impotent. We will examine the event not as a chaotic firefight, but as a clinical case study in the eternal conflict between meticulous planning and adaptive, high-stress human performance. In the cash-in-transit business, we have a saying that is repeated until it becomes a part of your very marrow. The vehicle is your weapon, your shield, and your coffin. It is the single most critical piece of equipment in the operational triad of crew, cargo, and conveyance. It is designed to absorb punishment, to deter casual assault, and to provide a mobile safe room from which to coordinate a response. But what is often forgotten in the technical specifications and the armor ratings is that last grim descriptor. If you allow it to become static, if you surrender your initiative and mobility, it ceases to be a shield and begins its transformation into a tomb. The driver that morning understood this principle not as an abstract concept, but as a physical law as immutable as gravity. The operation itself was a routine sweep run, a high-risk but necessary component of the financial logistics chain. The crew's task was to service a series of private banking institutions and corporate clients, consolidating their liquid assets at the end of the business day for transport to a central processing vault. This type of run is inherently vulnerable. Its very nature creates a predictable pattern, a rhythm of movement through a city's arteries that can be studied, timed, and ultimately intercepted. Despite variations in routing and timing, the fundamental start and end points of the sweep remain consistent. A determined adversary with sufficient resources for surveillance can, over time, develop a highly accurate predictive model of the vehicle's probable locations. This is not a failure of the crew. It is a systemic vulnerability in the operational model itself. The vehicle they were operating was a state-of-the-art armored personnel carrier, custom-built by a specialized security vehicle company for high-threat environments. It was rated at a B6 armor level, meaning its composite steel and aramid fiber body was designed to defeat rifle rounds up to 7.62 by 51 mm full metal jacket. The windows were multi-layered ballistic glass, over 40 mm thick, capable of absorbing multiple impacts from the same caliber before significant degradation. However, B6 armor is a compromise. It is not infallible. It is vulnerable to sustained, concentrated fire, which can cause heat-related structural failure, and to higher velocity armor-piercing rounds. Its most significant limitation is a phenomenon known as spalling. Even when a round is stopped, the kinetic energy transfer can be so violent that it causes fragments of the interior armor plate to break away. turning into a deadly shower of shrapnel inside the crew compartment. The vehicle's tires were run flats, solid composite rings inside the rubber that could support the vehicle's weight and allow it to travel for up to 50 miles at reduced speed, even after a complete loss of pressure. This specific feature would prove to be one of the most critical technological components in the entire engagement. The crew was a standard 3-man element. The cargo guard, a junior officer with 2 years on the job, was secured in the rear compartment, isolated from the cab. His role was purely defensive, a last line of protection for the assets. The passenger guard, a 5-year veteran, handled communications and served as the immediate support for the driver. And then there was the driver himself. He was a man in his late 40s with over 20 years of experience in the executive protection and armored transport sector. His record was a quiet testament to his professionalism. 2 decades of high-risk assignments without a single major incident. He was not a cowboy. He was a methodical, quiet professional who viewed his work not as a job, but as a discipline. He had spent thousands of hours behind the wheel of vehicles exactly like this one, his mind and body conditioned by relentless training to respond to threats not with panic, but with process. His experience was the intangible asset, the one element that could not be quantified on a technical specification sheet, and the one factor the enemy planners had fatally miscalculated. This brings us to the inciting failure, the invisible crack in the operational foundation that made the violence possible. The ambush was not a crime of opportunity. It was the result of a catastrophic intelligence failure within the security company's client network. Subsequent investigations revealed that a compromised mid-level employee at one of the banking institutions had been selling operational data, including transport schedules, vehicle identifiers, and crew manifests, to the trafficking organization for months. The crew was not driving into a random encounter. They were driving into a meticulously prepared trap based on insider information. They had been betrayed long before the first shot was fired. Their armor, their training, their procedures, all of it was predicated on the assumption of a secure operational environment. That assumption had been rendered false. They were not defending against a threat. They were the designated target of a planned military action. To understand the driver's decision, we must first understand the mind of his adversary. The 6-man team was not a gang of opportunistic thugs. Forensic analysis of the scene, their equipment, and their tactics pointed to individuals with formal military or even special operations training. They were disciplined, equipped with high-grade weapons, and they operated with a chilling efficiency. Their loadouts consisted of 5.56 millimeter carbines, a common choice. But crucially, one member was armed with a 7.62 millimeter belt-fed machine gun, a weapon specifically intended for suppressive fire and vehicle degradation. They had body armor, encrypted communications, and a clear command structure. These were professionals executing a planned mission. Their choice of location was tactically brilliant. They selected a 4-lane underpass on a stretch of urban highway approximately 3 miles from the city center. This location offered several key advantages. First, it was a natural choke point, funneling all traffic into a confined space. Second, the concrete walls of the underpass would contain their target, limit escape vectors, and amplify the psychological effect of their gunfire. Third, the positioning created what is known in ambush methodology as a perfect L-shaped kill zone. The main element, including the machine gun, was positioned on an embankment overlooking the entrance to the underpass, while a smaller blocking element was positioned at the exit. This allowed them to engage the target from both its front and its flank simultaneously. Finally, the location's distance from the nearest law enforcement precinct guaranteed them a response time of no less than 5 minutes, and likely closer to 8. They had calculated that this was more than enough time to disable the vehicle, breach it, and escape with the cargo. The entire enemy plan was constructed upon a single critical assumption. It was an assumption born of intellectual arrogance and a fundamental misunderstanding of their opponent. They assumed compliance. They believed that the driver of the armored vehicle, when faced with a sudden, inexplicable blockade and the eruption of gunfire, would do what every training manual and corporate policy dictated. He would stop. He would brake the vehicle, seek cover within its armored shell, radio for help, and wait. This is standard operating procedure. It is designed to protect the crew from small arms fire and to de-escalate, turning the situation into a barricade scenario for law enforcement to resolve. The attackers had planned for this. Their strategy depended on it. A static vehicle could be systematically dismantled. Its tires could be shredded, its engine block destroyed with concentrated fire, and its doors breached with explosives. Their plan was a complex, interlocking mechanism, and the mainspring of that mechanism was the driver's adherence to his own training. This was their fatal flaw. They had planned for the procedure, but they had not planned for the man. At 6:47 p.m., the armored vehicle, weighing approximately 5,500 pounds, was traveling at a steady 45 miles per hour as it approached the underpass. The light was fading. The traffic was moderate. Inside the cab, the atmosphere was one of routine. The passenger guard was logging their progress, his attention focused on his console. The driver was scanning, his eyes moving in a practiced, ceaseless pattern. Mirrors, forward view, instruments, mirrors. This is the baseline state of a professional, a calm alertness, a state of relaxed readiness. The world outside the ballistic glass was normal. It was this very normalcy that was the first sign of danger. As they neared the mouth of the underpass, the driver observed the anomaly. A single sedan was stopped sideways, blocking the two right-hand lanes. There was no smoke, no sign of a collision, no one standing outside. It was simply there, a silent, incongruous obstruction. This was the first stage of the OODA loop observation. For the passenger guard, this was just a traffic jam. His mind, conditioned by years of uneventful runs, engaged in normalcy bias. He saw what he expected to see, an accident, a stalled car. He reached for the radio handset to report the blockage, as procedure dictated. But the driver observed something different. He saw the lack of context. He saw the unnatural stillness. He saw the perfect positioning of the vehicle, not as an accident, but as a barrier. The second stage is orientation. This is the most critical phase, where raw data is processed through the lens of experience, training, and intuition. The passenger guard oriented himself to a civilian traffic problem. The driver oriented himself to a tactical problem. His 20 years of experience created a mental library of threat indicators, and the scene in front of him matched the profile for the opening stage of an ambush. He understood in a fraction of a second that the sedan was not an obstacle. It was bait. It was the cork in the bottle. He knew that the real threat was not the visible object, but the unseen enemy who had placed it there. His mind calculated the geometry of the underpass, the lack of escape routes, the vulnerability of his position. He oriented not to what he was seeing, but to what he knew must be there, waiting in the shadows. This led to the third stage, decision. Standard operating procedure presented a clear, unambiguous course of action. Stop the vehicle at a safe distance. Report the obstruction. Do not engage. Await instructions. This procedure is designed to minimize risk and corporate liability. In this context, it was a death sentence. The driver's alternative was a radical departure from protocol. It was an act of profound aggression. His decision was to refuse the premise of the ambush. He would not stop. He would not wait. He would accelerate. He would transform his vehicle from a target into a weapon. He would drive through the blockade. This decision was made in less than 3 seconds, a silent, internal process that would determine the outcome of the entire event. The final stage is action. As the passenger guard was still reporting the traffic obstruction, the driver's right foot pressed down on the accelerator. The vehicle's powerful turbo diesel engine responded, the truck lurching forward with a surge of torque. He did not shout a warning. He did not explain his reasoning. He simply acted. This is the essence of high-stress performance, the collapse of the space between decision and action until they are a single, unified event. The enemy's timeline was triggered by the vehicle's refusal to slow down. At 6:47 and 21 seconds, the first phase of their attack began. A single marksman positioned on the embankment fired two precisely aimed 7.62 millimeter rounds into the driver's side of the windshield. The impacts were deafening inside the cab, creating brilliant spiderweb-like patterns on the ballistic glass. This was not suppressive fire. It was a psychological assault. The purpose was to shock, to disorient, and to reinforce the driver's instinct to brake, to seek the perceived safety of a stationary position. The rounds were stopped, but the sheer kinetic force sent a tremor through the vehicle's frame. 3 seconds later, at 6:47 and 24 seconds, with the armored truck still accelerating, the second phase of the attack commenced. The belt-fed machine gun opened up from the same embankment position, unleashing a torrent of fire across the vehicle's front and left side. This was true suppressive fire. Its purpose was not necessarily to penetrate the armor, but to degrade the vehicle's capabilities and to shatter the crew's will to resist. The sound inside the cab became a continuous concussive roar, a physical force that vibrated through the seats and the floor. The windshield began to cloud and fracture under the relentless impacts, visibility dropping to near zero. This is the moment when most individuals would be paralyzed by sensory overload and mortal fear. The driver, however, was now focused on a single point, the rear bumper of the blocking sedan. At 6:47 and 27 seconds, as the armored truck closed the final 50 yards, the third phase was initiated. The rest of the assault team, positioned along the embankment, opened fire with their carbines, adding to the storm of projectiles. Simultaneously, a second vehicle, a heavy pickup truck, moved from its concealed position to block the road behind them, sealing the kill zone. The ambush envelope was now complete. The crew was trapped between the forward blocking element, the flanking fire element, and the rear blocking element. From the attacker's perspective, the situation was now under their complete control. They had established fire superiority and had isolated their target. All that remained was for the vehicle to succumb to the punishment and grind to a halt. The countermeasure was the driver's singular, decisive act of defiance. He held his line, his foot locked on the accelerator. He was no longer driving a truck. He was aiming a projectile. The passenger guard reported later that in that moment he was certain they were going to die. He was screaming, but the noise of the incoming fire drowned out all sound. The driver remained silent, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the point of impact through the rapidly disintegrating windshield. This was the override of the deepest human instinct for self-preservation. Every fiber of his being, every untrained impulse would have screamed to hit the brakes. But his training had forged a different instinct. In an ambush, mobility is life. Static defense is death. At 6:47 and 39 seconds, 18 seconds after the initial observation, the armored vehicle, now traveling at over 60 miles per hour, struck the blocking sedan. The physics of the collision were devastating. The truck's reinforced steel bumper, designed for exactly this purpose, impacted the sedan's trunk at a slight angle. The massive disparity in mass and momentum resulted in the sedan being thrown violently aside, spinning into the concrete wall of the underpass. The armored truck, its front end crumpling to absorb the impact, plowed through the newly created gap. The sound of the impact was a brutal, grinding shriek of metal, momentarily overwhelming even the sound of the gunfire. The armored truck was now through the primary blockade, but it was heavily damaged. The collision had ruptured the radiator, and the engine was already beginning to overheat. Two of the tires on the left side had been shredded by the sustained machine gun fire, and the vehicle was now riding on its run-flat inserts, its speed dropping. The windshield was a mosaic of opaque fractures, forcing the driver to peer through a small, clear patch at the very bottom of the glass. But it was moving. It was clearing the fatal zone. The attackers were momentarily stunned. Their plan, so carefully constructed, had been shattered in an instant by a single, non-compliant action. An exquisite irony of the situation was that their own forward-blocking vehicle, now a crumpled wreck against the underpass wall, had become a temporary obstacle for their pursuit teams. The brief pursuit was a desperate, disorganized affair on the part of the attackers. They had planned for a static assault, not a high-speed chase. By the time their chase vehicles could navigate around the wreckage, the armored truck had gained a lead of several hundred yards. Despite the damage, the driver kept the vehicle moving for another 2 miles, putting distance between his crew and the threat, before the overheating engine finally seized. He coasted the crippled truck into the parking lot of a brightly lit commercial area, bringing it to a halt in a position of maximum visibility. The engagement was over. The total duration of the firefight, from the first shot to the truck clearing the kill zone, was less than 30 seconds. In that time, an estimated 230 rounds had struck the vehicle. The number of rounds that had successfully penetrated the crew compartment was 0. The aftermath was a study in contrast. For the crew of the armored vehicle, the outcome was survival. The cargo guard in the rear was unharmed. The passenger guard suffered minor lacerations to his face and hands from spalling. The shower of interior armor fragments caused by the sheer kinetic force of the machine gun rounds impacting the exterior. The driver sustained a fractured wrist and severe bruising from the collision, his hands having been slammed against the steering wheel on impact. None of the injuries were life-threatening. The cargo, the $5 million that was the entire purpose of the attack, was completely secure. The vehicle, however, was functionally destroyed. It was a testament to both the violence of the attack and the quality of its own construction. Every body panel was pockmarked with impacts. The entire left side was shredded. The front end was a collapsed wreck. All 4 tires were gone. It would never run again, but it had performed its ultimate function. It had served as a shield and a weapon, and it had refused to become a coffin. For the antagonists, the outcome was catastrophic failure. Their return on investment was 0. Not only did they fail to secure the cargo, but their meticulously planned operation had unraveled into a chaotic retreat, leaving behind a wealth of forensic evidence. The abandoned blocking sedan was traced, providing law enforcement with their first critical lead. Ballistic evidence from the scene allowed investigators to link the weapons to other unsolved violent crimes in the region. Most significantly, 2 of the attackers were neutralized during the engagement. They were not shot by the crew, who never fired a single round. They were in the blocking sedan when the driver made his decision. Their own trap had killed them. Within 6 months, the intelligence gathered from the scene of the failed ambush led to a series of raids that dismantled the entire trafficking organization's local cell, including the compromised bank employee who had enabled the attack. The tactical analysis of this event yields several critical lessons. It is a perfect synthesis of the relationship between technology, institutional process, and the human factor. The technology, the B6 rated armor and the run-flat tires, performed exactly as designed. It bought time. The armor absorbed the punishment, and the run-flats provided the crucial seconds of mobility needed to escape the kill zone. But technology alone is never a solution. It is merely an enabler. The institutional process, the reliance on standard operating procedure, and the failure of intelligence security was an abject failure. The intelligence leak created the vulnerability, and the standard procedure for dealing with a blocked route would have led directly to the crew's demise. The decisive element, the factor that tipped the scales from certain death to improbable survival, was the human in the loop. It was the driver's 2 decades of experience, his intuitive grasp of threat assessment, and his profound psychological refusal to become a victim. Revisiting the antagonist's failure, we see the classic flaw of a technically proficient but strategically rigid adversary. They created a perfect tactical problem, but they only conceived of one possible answer. Their entire plan was a linear equation that relied on their target behaving in a predictable, compliant manner. When the driver chose a different variable, aggression instead of passivity, movement instead of stasis, their entire equation collapsed. They were defeated not by superior firepower or technology, but by a single act of human willpower. They failed to account for the possibility that their target might be willing to risk the certainty of a violent collision over the certainty of execution in a static kill zone. They understood the physics of ballistics, but they did not understand the psychology of a survivor. From this incident, we can distill 4 core lessons that remain relevant across the entire spectrums of security operations. First, intelligence security is the foundation of all physical security. The most advanced armor is worthless if the enemy knows your route, your destination, and your schedule. The battle was nearly lost before the crew even started their engine that day, because of a failure that occurred miles away in a quiet office. A breach in data security is as fatal as a breach in an armored hull. Second, static defense is death. This is the central tactical lesson of the engagement. An armored vehicle's greatest strengths are its armor and its mobility. To surrender mobility is to voluntarily discard 50% of its defensive capability. The moment the vehicle stops in a kill zone, the initiative passes entirely to the attacker. The target is now on their timeline. They can maneuver, apply specialized tools, and dismantle the vehicle's defenses at their leisure. The driver understood this. He understood that the only way to survive an ambush is to pass through it as quickly and violently as possible, accepting the damage as the price of survival. Third, equipment buys time, but training determines outcomes. The B-6 armor did not defeat the enemy. It absorbed bullets for the 30 seconds the driver needed to implement his solution. The run-flat tires did not guarantee escape. They provided the few miles of mobility required to get out of the immediate danger area. Technology is a finite resource. It provides a buffer, a window of opportunity. It is the training, discipline, and mindset of the human operator that allows them to exploit that window. Without the driver's trained response, the vehicle would have been nothing more than a well-armored casket for 3 men. Fourth and finally, you must evolve your methodology to match the sophistication of the threat. The security company's procedures were designed to counter low-level criminal threats, smash and grabs, opportunistic attacks. They were not designed to counter a military-style ambush executed by a disciplined team with insider intelligence. The event served as a brutal catalyst for change, forcing the entire industry to reevaluate its training and operational protocols. The assumption of a compliant response was erased from the doctrine, replaced by a new emphasis on aggressive dynamic countermeasures. The driver's improvisation became the new standard operating procedure. In the final analysis, the event was not about the $5 million or the armored truck. It was about the value of a single, correct decision made under unimaginable pressure. A multi-million-dollar corporate security infrastructure, a piece of mobile armor worth $250,000. and the lives of 3 men were all saved by the intangible quality of one man's professional judgment. He saw the trap, refused to enter it on the enemy's terms, and in 18 seconds fundamentally rewrote the tactical equation in his favor. There is a concept in performance psychology we call the mental bridge. It is the psychological crossing point where years of repetitive training, drills, and simulations are converted into instantaneous, instinctual action. It is the moment where conscious thought ceases and the trained response takes over. Most people, even those with training, never have to cross that bridge. It remains a theoretical construct. For the driver, that bridge had to be crossed in the space between one heartbeat and the next. As the first rounds impacted his windshield, he was on that bridge. His decision to accelerate was not even a conscious thought in the conventional sense. It was the inevitable, conditioned output of 20 years of preparation, meeting a lethal, immediate stimulus. The fight goes to those who understand that the only way out of the kill zone is through it. End of debrief.